Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Student Life Advisors podcast. My name is Trey.
I'm Elaine.
And today we are going to be talking about how can you use financial aid. So we're going to be looking at this, breaking down when do you get it. We'll actually talk about that second. First, how does it work? And then lastly, what are the things you can and can't use it for? So let's jump into the first part of that. How does this whole thing even work?
Yeah, so when it comes to it's always good to start with that because you really need to get an understanding of how this works. You filled out the applications. That was probably a little challenging.
I went through all of the paperwork. I'm doing it.
All of it. And then all of a sudden you get from your school your financial aid award letter and it's got some money on there.
Commas maybe,
some commas, some zeros, some grants, scholarships, hopefully.
Yes.
And then it can also include things like work study and loans. And we get a lot of questions. This is something the first time it happened to me, I had no idea how it worked. And I wish I did because I might have planned differently.
Oh.
Because there are some things that happen in the whole process. And the biggest key to understand is most of your financial aid doesn't go to you directly. It goes to your school first.
Interesting.
So is that something you experienced? Because I know you got some grants and scholarships.
Well, as we touched on in the first episode, when I had my little mishap because of switching some numbers and whatnot, at first, I didn't understand that as well. But once I did have some scholarships come in, my money went to the school first. And then after that, they sent some stuff to me. So I was always used to getting paid last.
Yeah, so that's how it kind of works. It's really important to know that because it doesn't matter if you have federal student loans, private student loans, grants. Scholarships may be a little different if you're getting them from third-party companies and organizations, but you just have to know, especially if you're depending on that money super, super early for other costs, it's going to go to your school first. Now, your school will then take that financial aid money that they're giving on your behalf to help cover your tuition and fees and all that, everything you owe them, they'll take that first. And if there's anything left over, that's something they'll issue to you, which you said you got a credit balance refund. I also got a credit balance refund. And that's just how that process kind of works. Scholarships can be a little weird.
Yeah, I've read a couple articles and seen that scholarships do get little idiosyncrasies here and there. There's some cases where the scholarships go directly to your school, but then there's also some other cases where the scholarships may come to you, but you still want to report that to the school.
Yes, so you definitely want to report that to the school. Some common scenarios where we see this, even our scholarshippoints.com, you can be as young as 13.
And win a scholarship.
Chances are you could be going directly to college, but chances are you're not going to be going to college for a few years. So if you win a scholarship early on, which we always recommend, that's a top pro tip always, especially if you caught Ryan Kelly's episode, is to start looking for scholarships super early. But if you do win them, you might be in a situation where you have to figure out how to handle that money for a few years. Something that we do is we help the family make sure they get it in a free college savings plan. But other scholarship providers might defer that until you're ready to go to college.
Yeah, some of them do that.
And then once again, guess what? The money goes directly to the college first.
Yeah, so you have that situation where maybe the person is wondering what's going to happen and all of that, but that kind of leads us into okay, it goes to the school first. Mm-hmm. In most cases, wonderful, but when do I get my money?
Yeah. And why do we care about when do we get your money? Because you might be relying on it?
Yes, you might.
So and this is, I'll just throw in a little bit about disbursements. I've had to explain this a few different times because it's really not that intuitive until you've lived it first. All disbursement means, because it's kind of one of those big terms that we throw around like everyone should know what it means. Disbursement. But if you've never done it or heard of it before, you might be a little confused. Essentially, that's having the money being paid to your account on behalf of you. So the money's getting dispersed. So your school actually runs and kind of operates a lot of this for you because they're getting all that money first. So they'll get that to your account. And keep in mind, when you're looking at that financial aid award letter, it's interesting because you might get a loan for $5,500, but you generally don't get it all at once.
Oh no, they got to break that stuff up.
Yep, and your Pell Grant, if you get some grants, they usually break it up. So it's super important to see on those financial aid award letters if they break up your money by term, so you can get an idea of how that kind of works. But it's one of those things where you have to know what the school's disbursement calendar is, because if you're waiting for that money or hoping to use it for something like, I don't know, an off-campus apartment, and you're moving in way before the start of your term, you might not actually have access to your money yet.
And that's the thing, the disbursement calendars can differ from school to school. So even though they've received the federal funds, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who's receiving federal funds for that particular term is going to be getting that at the same time.
Yeah.
So it gets tricky.
Understanding that disbursement calendar is important because I'll tell you a little something about happened to me with some living expenses.
Well, tell us what happened. What's going on?
So I went to a school that didn't guarantee housing after a certain year, so I had to move off campus. And I had some roommates I was going to move in with, trying to be smart about it, keep the costs low. But keep in mind, like, depending on where you live, it's kind of expensive sometimes to rent an apartment.
And you went to, no offense, a very expensive place.
I went to an expensive school and I lived in an expensive city.
Yes.
At the time. And it was expensive then, and right now I'm sure it's astronomical. It's hard to manage to live there. You probably need like several roommates to help you through. But I was able to make it work. I didn't realize some of the obstacles I'd face, because I'm just thinking you go and you pay your rent and you basically get an apartment. Well, in the Boston area, it was very common to pay first, last month's rent, security deposit, and a realtor's fee. And they all equaled 1 month's rent. So that was 4 times my rent up front at the time you sign the lease, which is several months before your term even starts.
Yeah, that's tough.
So thankfully, I believe my roommate's family covered some of the stuff that they'd get back, like the security deposit, and helped with the realtor's fee. Had to go beg mom and dad for some help to get some of those fees covered so that I could move in and eventually pay them back. But it was very expensive. And the thing is, I didn't understand why I couldn't get my money earlier. I remember asking financial aid and they're like, well, you have to wait till the start of the term. And I'm like, but you need to be settled in an apartment. You can't move in the same day you're starting classes.
Yeah.
Or like 2 weeks later, like, where am I going to go?
Yeah, they're telling you to wait until the start of the term, and you're like, my lease already started.
Yeah, like 2 weeks before, move
problem.
in. And you have to have that money up front. Like, you can't sign the lease and give them like, I swear I'll give this to you.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that.
They don't really take that like IOU type stuff very well. So it's something you kind of have to plan ahead for, because yes, you can use your financial aid for living expenses, but you need to plan ahead and understand what the costs are where you're living.
Right.
And every city's different.
That's true. You can go to school in a place like Boston, or you can go to school in another city that's not as expensive, and maybe your off-campus housing options are more affordable depending on, where you end up going to school ultimately. So I'm completely with you. Like, a place like Boston, I can only imagine what's the cost of off-campus housing there, but then some places that are more affordable in general, then the same can apply for if you're going to school. So.
And the weird thing is the math ended up that I think I was technically saving money.
Oh, really? Living off campus
based on the fees for living on campus.
Right.
Because I also had a roommate, so we were splitting some of those costs.
You know what? That's a good point, too. Because if you do live on campus, you can't be as flexible with the way that you figure out who's going to pay for this and how you want to divide things. They're like, no, this is a dorm for 2 people. This is a dorm for 3 people. This is a dorm for 1 person. So you're paying that regardless. So that's a good point. You can't really split up the things like you would in the real world. You
can, and the other thing too is there were some options where I didn't necessarily want the meal plan anymore. So I had the ability, I'm really big on like cooking. That's like one of my other side passions other than financial aid.
Yeah.
So I was okay with eating at home, cooking at home, buying groceries based on my needs versus, kind of doing the feeling of like eating out all the time. Because as great as meal plans are and as great as the food was, after a few years.
Oh yeah, you don't even have to say it. I had people that, because I never lived on campus, but I had friends who lived on campus and they'd have unlimited swipes, and sometimes they'd have guest swipes as well. So I'd join them and I'd go in there and be like, oh wow, it's a buffet in here. And then, they're like getting one thing and I'm over here getting 3 or 4 things, and they're like, man, I eat this every day. It's nothing fancy about it. So I feel you.
And the weird thing is room and board, food, that sort of stuff, like you can definitely use some of your financial aid to help cover that while you're going to school.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like if you have a meal plan, I always encourage people to use it, kind of like tough it out and have the school lifestyle. If you have to have one, or you're living on campus and you don't have easy access to a stove or a microwave, because a lot of dorms don't have access to full kitchens.
That's true.
Thankfully we did, but when I finally moved off campus, I made more of a point of cooking at home and not relying on the meal plan, because I felt like I could make meals that I really wanted and have, and we had a full kitchen, which is a little different.
Thank you for making it to this point in the podcast. As you know, we give you a bonus code with every episode. Use the bonus code QUALIFY for 100 points that you can redeem on scholarshippoints.com for exclusive entries into our exclusive scholarships. Once again, the bonus code is QUALIFY. Now let's get back to the podcast. Yeah, that's true. And then that's the thing too. Some dorms, they may have microwaves, and maybe there is a kitchen, but to also not have the ability to go and use that stuff on demand when you need it, that could be a differentiator too.
And the storage.
Yeah. Yeah, where are you gonna put your pots and pans in your dorm,
And even sharing with a fridge, like a mini fridge with one other person, can get full real fast.
Yeah, especially if you're someone who likes to go and cook and try different things and whatnot. That's
and you have to be thoughtful. You can't just be like, oh, here's my meal prep for the week and take up the whole fridge.
Yeah. Man, I never really thought about that, because I knew people who lived in the dorms. I never lived in the dorms. I was always off campus, staying with family that was here while I was in school. So for me, that whole concept of, how does that really feel? It didn't really register with me. Now, I did live on campus in high school, but that was different. Everything was, went to the cafeteria every time we needed to eat and stuff. So. And
also you're a little younger then, so you don't have like free reign of like just wandering to get food or that sort of thing.
No, not at all.
In college, it's a little easy to stop at the coffee shop, but
yep.
I'm not saying you are not allowed to ever buy yourself a coffee, but you just want to be smart and resourceful with your money, especially if you're using that credit balance refund. Which could include loans. This essentially means the money you got back is loan money.
Right, because what if you took out more loans than what you needed, in the sense? Not what you needed from the perspective of like, oh, you don't need the money, but you've covered what you needed for your tuition, perhaps, and then there's all this other money because you're borrowing up to that cost of attendance. But in reality, based on your situation, you might not need that extra $1,000 or $2,000 that you got. And
you're using it on things that are a little luxury.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you're not allowed to ever have something nice. It's just you want to be smart about it and really think of it as, kind of a once every so often thing, just because you're not going to repay that dollar for dollar.
Yeah, you're not. Think about it. You get that. You're using the money that you borrowed to pay for something, and then if you don't pay off that loan, that every dollar you spend, you could be really paying like $1.10, per dollar, $1.03, whatever it is.
Every day.
Yeah, exactly. So
for 10 to 30 years.
Yeah, it's like, do you really want to use that money for that thing that maybe isn't a necessity? Like, you might have the leeway to use it, but is that just wise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to understanding your lifestyle. I think this took a little bit for me to get that in my head, because you have people at college who come from all different backgrounds and all different financial situations at home and all different support situations. And it's easy to compare yourself or want what maybe somebody has when they're living right next to you. And you can't always have it.
And it's in your face.
And your lifestyle might change drastically from living at home with your parents or whoever you were living with.
Right.
And they were helping you cover some of your costs and maybe buying you some nice things or letting you spend more money. Then sometimes families turn that off.
Yeah.
For students saying, you're kind of an adult now. It's time for you to budget and get yourself all settled. And this is the time for you to learn that. And sometimes it's hard to just switch.
Yeah.
So it's all about understanding the lifestyle you have to live by. I mean, it all goes back to setting a budget and kind of putting some constraints on yourself, something you can double check. Because here's the thing, when it comes to financial aid, you can use it for things beyond those direct costs, like the things you owe the school,
tuition,
all of that. You can actually use it because, like you said, cost of attendance. Cost of attendance includes far more than just direct costs to the school. Right. It has other reasonable costs that are considered, here's another term, qualified educational expenses. And that's actually more of like an IRS term.
Interesting.
So this is the part too where all the decisions you're making and the different things happening in your life tie back to, some real life things you're going to have to face from not only now, but from now on.
Yeah.
So filing taxes and that sort of thing. And qualified educational expenses, they're really important. Generally, you can rely on
the student budget, the
student
cost
budget.
of attendance, how they break that down.
Yeah, how that's broken down. Because if it's listed on there, you probably can qualify it as a qualified educational expense. But this even ties back to some of those outside scholarships.
Oh yeah, what about if you get a scholarship and then it could be considered as taxable income?
Yeah, so it doesn't happen all the time, but if you have a lot of scholarships and you get some of that money back or you get some of that money directly, you still have to use it on qualified educational expenses. And if you don't, it could be considered taxable income, which then you'd have to put on your taxes and see if you owe anything at the end of the year. So it's just something you want to be aware of and understand when it comes to using your financial aid. Yes, you can use it for some extra things. Like we have this conversation all the time about what you need versus like what's really a luxury. Because every category in that cost of attendance there's a luxury level.
Oh yeah.
And you don't have to go there. And you probably shouldn't go there unless,
Right.
You probably shouldn't.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at the student budgets, I was looking at one today, food is one that's in there. It's part of the calculation that they use to determine like how much is it going to cost for you to be a student this year. It's in there. However, when you look at that food budget, it's normally not the food budget for someone who's going to some 5-star restaurant or something.
Food deliveries every day. It gets expensive.
Yeah, and they're not having, there's no way that they're incorporating those types of expenses when they're making those calculations. It's like, no, this food budget that's laid out by the school does not include your fancy restaurants that you want to go to and buy fancy food from in between class. No.
It goes back to being reasonable, you know? It's hard word to define. It means something different to everyone else, and that's true.
It's a gray one.
Yeah.
It's a gray one.
And the thing is, it goes back to that. If you're relying solely on financial aid and the money you got, and you need that to last your full term, and you don't want to run out.
Oh, goodness.
Like, you just have to be reasonable about it and look at your budget. Like, we keep pushing the budget thing.
It sounds boring, but I think it's a must-have.
It is a must-have.
I think it's a must-have. That's a non-negotiable for me.
Because then you can reevaluate how you spent your budget and how you went through it, make tweaks for the next year, and then you can actually see what happens when you ignore the budget, which sometimes happens as well.
You willing to take that risk? I wouldn't take
I
risk.
mean,
I wouldn't
it's
risk
not that
ignoring
you're
the
willing.
budget, Elaine.
It's not about taking that risk, but when you're learning how to use one, you might slip up here and there.
Yeah, that's true.
But, we do know that sometimes college students run out of money. And if we don't have any sort of constraints or any sort of thing to lay out, like how you plan to use that money, where you can see where maybe you strayed a little bit, it might be hard to figure out how to fix it next time. But I'm never saying like you can't, if your family is willing to help or gifts come in for something you need that's maybe a luxury item, I'm not saying to return it or,
Absolutely.
be upset about it. It's just understanding like your money and how you manage it is different than, maybe getting gifts or help from other people.
Right.
And also you can work for some of those luxury items every once in a while. If you know that you really want to go on a trip or do something, you could work to earn that money to help cover the costs of that.
Right.
And not necessarily rely on your financial aid that you got that's meant to be for your educational expenses.
Yeah. You want to go on a vacation, don't use your financial aid.
Don't use your financial aid. You're not really supposed to.
No, don't do it.
It's not really legal. If you look at your terms and conditions, even on some of your FAFSA form, if you had student loans, if you read through them, like you're supposed to be using it for qualified educational expenses and certify that. Things like spring break, they're not a qualified educational expense.
Don't do it.
Even though some people, are able to do that, unfortunately not everyone can.
Right.
But it's something you could work towards or a goal you can do for another year if you're earning money to help save for a trip like that. But I would just say be careful.
I'm with you. I would err on the side of caution there.
It's always best to just kind of manage and get an idea of how your financial aid should work and be careful with it because you can slip up along the way. And if you run out of money and you don't have support, it could be a really tough few weeks.
Seriously. That's why we gotta have conversations like these so we can put the people in the know. All right, y'all. Well, that does it for another episode of the Student Life Advisors podcast. Once again, my name is Trey.
I'm Elaine.
And we'll be back at you with another one. Stay tuned.